Campuses across the country have been hit with a massive wave of anti-Semitic protest. From Berkeley to Yale to most famously Columbia, there have been students who have, in the name of Palestine, in the name of resistance or revolution, they have been setting up encampments and liberation zones, as they call them, to encourage their universities to, and I'm quoting here, their demands to divest from Israel, to invest in Gaza, and to also simply virtue signal along with them in their cause. Now, in this video, I'm going to cover a few of these instances, but then after explaining them, I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to give all of us who love America and those of us who believe that these protests are a sign of a much darker phenomenon happening both in our society, in the universities in this country, and in higher education in general. I'm going to give us a few strategies, a few pointers, and perhaps an origin story of where this kind of behavior came from. But first, I must begin with some of the harrowing events we have seen happen across college campuses most recently. Jewish students at Columbia University, where this encampment has been happening for days, where there have been several rounds of arrests, where there have been a lot of rowdiness happening, where students have kind of gone into remote learning due to how chaotic the situation has been. Jewish students have claimed that they are being harassed. In fact, there was a Jewish student that went on News Nation and claimed this exact same thing, that he was walking around campus with a yarmulke, and because of that, he was harassed.
I walked onto campus 3 days ago in the evening to go to my lab. I was walking by. I was identifiably Jewish because I was wearing my yarmulke. In fact, it was Shabbat. And what happened was that I heard someone yell my name, and then I heard them yell out my student ID number, my personal student ID number. What? And it was coming from this lawn area where there's this encampment. And they said, "We know who you are. We know that you're a biology PhD student, and you're not welcome on this campus."
They told you that. They said you're not welcome on this campus.
Yes, ma'am, unprompted. I was not there to counter-protest. I was not there to cause any sort of issue. I was just walking across campus.
Right outside of the Columbia protest, there is an adjacent New York University protest. And at this protest, which has many of the same people who are supporting the Columbia protest, the protesters said jubilantly that they wish to burn down Tel Aviv and that they support Hamas. Go. Now, on the other side of the country in California, at Cal Polytech Humboldt, a group of pro-Palestinian students literally flooded an administration building, shut it down, held it hostage, seized it essentially, and then when the police tried to evict them from the building that they were wrongly seizing, they hit the police officers over the head with water bottle jugs, they cursed at them, and they pushed them out. Now, at Columbia, going back to Columbia, there was a speaker that said that the Al-Aqsa flood, I'm probably butchering that, put the global intifada back into motion. They're basically referencing the October 7th attacks, and they're praising it. Go.
Let it be known that it was the Al-Aqsa flood that put the global intifada back on the table again. And it is the sacrificial spirit of the Palestinian freedom fighters that will guide every struggle on every corner of the earth to victory. Yeah! What are we ready to give up? How far are we willing to go in losing all the trappings of a respectable life? These imperial spoils that we have been taught to value as individuals. As the great black communist James Boggs said, the revolution to be made in the United States will be the first revolution in history to require the masses to make material sacrifices rather than to acquire more material things. We must give up many of the things which this country has enjoyed at the expense of damning over 1/3 of the world into a state of underdevelopment, ignorance, disease, and early death.
We should really understand what we're seeing. And this has been happening, by the way, over at Yale. Harvard kind of shut it down before it began to germinate, but it's been happening at MIT as well. It's been happening at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All of these elite universities across the country are experiencing this phenomenon. And we should really understand, before we get into the deeper issues of where did this come from, what are the philosophies behind these protests, what can we learn from it as a civilization, and how can we use this moment to teach us how to preserve our republic into the future as these things continue to happen. We need to understand that these events are wholly manufactured from the top down. The national branch of the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is an organization that has really been fanning the flames of anti-Semitism ever since the onset of October 7th and so on and so forth, they actually were very clear that they wanted students in their chapters or in groups that were affiliated with their chapters across the country to go in and seize universities. I quote, "The supposed power of our administrators is nothing compared to the strength of the united students, staff, and faculty committed to realizing justice and upholding Palestinian liberation on campus." This was written by the National Students for Justice in Palestine group on the social media. And they say, and I quote, "In the footsteps of our comrades at Rutgers, New Brunswick, SJP, Tufts, and Columbia, we will seize our universities and force the administration to divest for the people of Gaza, join the popular university, and take back our institutions." Now, the Students for Justice in Palestine is joined by the Democratic Socialists of America and several other left-wing groups that are all saying that we're all in this effort together, and they are mobilizing their students to go ahead and seize these campuses. Whenever an organization, I don't care what their ideology is, I don't care what their beliefs are, I don't care what their intentions are, whenever they say we're going to seize a university, what they are in effect saying is that they are going to illegitimately occupy a particular place in the name of their own cause without any regard for any other consideration. This is the revolutionary ideology which dominates so much leftist politics. And I say this, I call this encampment ethics. Write it down. Encampment ethics. Because whenever someone justifies behavior, it's important to understand what the justification is and how they speak. Now, encampment ethics is simply this idea that says you have the right to pursue a particular action at any means necessary if it means fulfilling the revolutionary ideology you happen to believe in. So in this case, these people believe in the idea of Palestinian liberation, and they believe that you can use force and violence to pursue those ideas so long as you actually achieve the end of whatever this Palestinian liberation is. Well, the problem with this is that it's a hermetically sealed moral idea that excludes every other consideration, social, political, and philosophical, from your calculus, and gives you a very limited, narrow, tunnel vision way of doing things, which then leads towards a totalistic ideology which dominates your mind to the point where you're not acting as a rational person, you are instead acting as a ideologically possessed ideologue that has no ability or is not showing the ability to actually look at these issues with the substance they actually have. If you want to argue about Israel and Palestine, that's a debate you can have. But to assume that everything you do, including the things that are obviously wrong, are moral because they serve your own personal goals is not rational. It's not good. It is detrimental both to your sense of morality and to those around you in society. But we are dealing with an anti-civilizational philosophy here, my friends. And that is what we must understand. The root cause of all of this goes back hundreds of years. A lot of folks like to tie it over to the Frankfurt School. I like to go back further than that. I think the root cause of what we are seeing today is not DEI or Marxism per se. They are simply symptoms of what we are seeing today. The root cause is rather the Prussianization of American education, which began in the 1840s and has unfortunately grown and infected our institutions and our society more and more and more as time has gone on. The Prussianization of American education essentially did something that made it so that education became about the internal world as opposed to the external world. Let me explain this to you. Education used to be about, traditionally, teaching about a particular subject and giving details about that subject and not attempting to put the ilk of society upon the minds of the pupil. But it became about the pupil having an experience with what they're being taught and relating that experience to society. So education When this idea from Germany was imported over to America, it became less about the intellectual well-being of the pupil and became more about, as John Dewey would say, the social consciousness of the pupil. Well, society moves in ways that are unpredictable and are radical. And if your value is rooted in what society says or does, you will never be able to have stability of mind that is required to understand the world around you. You will be a billiard ball that is being pushed around by whatever social wave comes next and comes hitherto. And that's the problem. And this problem is exemplified by a principle found within the Prussian idea of education called the principle of Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft, as Wilhelm von Humboldt said, is teaching for the sake of teaching. Well, not just for the sake of teaching, but teaching for the sake of teaching insofar as when we research and teach for the sake of teaching, we end up developing ideas more which benefit the government. This was the idea that was imported into America, first at University of Michigan, then to Johns Hopkins, and then swept through our country and created the notion of the research university, which researches for the sake of researching. Well, the problem with this is, if you're focused on researching for the sake of researching, and not researching for the sake of applying knowledge to the real world or ensuring the pupil has a good intellectual mindset, you can isolate yourself from the consequences of your ideas. This is where the ivory tower mindset comes from. It doesn't just come from people being conceited or pretentious, although it does come from that. It comes from having this notion that education is about the perpetuation of an institution and not about the strengthening and refinement of the mind and the morality of those you are educating. And we are seeing that manifest right now in the current collegiate environment, which is producing this anti-Semitic crap. Let me go a little bit step further. We also see this idea of education embodied in the notion that students at college need to have an experience. How many of you have heard the term college experience? College shouldn't be an experience. It should be an institution you go to refine your mind, to get skills, so you can get a job or you can understand the world better, whatever your fancy. But it is now an experience. So you've taken what should be a pedagogical activity and you've turned it into an all-encompassing experience. And if there's one thing we know about experience, that experience is in the realm of the subjective. Remember I talked about the internal versus the external? So they literally made education about you, which then allows you to isolate yourself from the world around you and think in your youthful hubris, because we're seeing youthful hubris on display here, that you know everything and that you can proceed with your ideas, and everyone who disagrees with you is either dominated mentally by a system of oppression or they are idiots or whatever. That is what this modern day idea of education has done to us. It has literally made experience king and made the truth a non-event. And we are seeing that manifest. We're seeing it manifest in terms of sanctimony. We're seeing it manifest in terms of the behavior that we are seeing. A lack of moral education paired with an exaltation of one's own limited experiences at such a young age is absolutely disastrous. You know, I'm going to be 24 in a month. A little bit over a month. And I understand that I don't know everything. And I understand that people at my age don't know everything. But when you have a group of people that don't know everything, and they are more susceptible to being moved by their passions as opposed to their reason, which is immature because they don't know everything, or they don't even know a lot of things, you have bad actors who would seek to weaponize their passions against the society. And that's what we're seeing here with these protests as well. Consider the fact that amongst these protests are a star-studded crowd of people that actually come from very wealthy, high-income families. People that, for example, like an intern for Letitia James and so on and so forth. There is a subset of the wealthy elite participating in these protests, pretending as if they are the revolutionary vanguard that's going to push forth a new reality for America. When in all reality, they are wealthy kids who are basically LARPing in a certain way to make themselves feel righteous. And whenever you see a movement that is astroturfed this way, that appears to be organic, but there are a bunch of people that are in the highest of the highest elites pushing it, you should be suspicious about the goals of this movement. We should also be suspicious of one thing as well. A lot of the kids we see captured by this ideological poison that we're seeing displayed across America recently are captured by peer pressure. You wouldn't believe. There are stats that say that conservative students in universities, this is a well-known fact, self-censor in order to avoid offending people. See, all human beings are social animals. That's a fundamental fact from which all morality, all ethics, and all civilizational building flows, right? But when you weaponize the social instinct of the human being and you turn it into a tool for propping up an oppressive ideology like Islamofascism, like communism, then what happens is you've essentially made the social person antisocial and you've made them suppress their authentic selves. And if I cannot interact with you with my authentic self, I will then do things that my authentic self would have never done in a million years, even if it means paying lip service towards the free Palestine narrative. Pure pressure, rather than sincere ideological conviction, has a lot to do with what we are seeing happening on college campuses right now. The youth have always been the tool of totalitarians, from communists like Mao Zedong to people like Adolf Hitler, for their machinations, because the youth are impressionable. Their minds are defenseless against the woes of propaganda, and the passions within them bubble up so high that you can exploit them like that. That's not to say that the youth are dumb. No, not at all. But it is to say that so many people who think they know so much actually know so little, and they are carried forth by their own conviction, as opposed to any kind of substance. We have a crisis of substance in this culture, which I believe is 110% pushing so many people down the wrong path. So the question becomes, my friends, what do we do? I think the answer is actually quite clear. On a policy level, there's little that can be done to destroy the loss of moral education and the hubris that is brought rise to in the West. But there is some things that can be done to help hasten along the destruction of this malefic condition. Number one, the federal government has to stop sponsoring these radicalization factories known as universities. The federal government, first of all, the government should not be funding education in the first place. There is no moral basis or legal basis, either in the Constitution or in natural law theory, for the government to fund these institutions in the first place. So that shouldn't even be happening. But even if we accept that it should be happening, a country should never fund its own destruction. Our country, America, likes to fund its own destruction in many ways, whether it be funding its own destruction by shipping millions upon billions of dollars to a foreign nation like Ukraine and enabling further death and conflict to happen in that nation, whether it be funding programs that surveil on Americans without getting a warrant, whether it be literally funding chaotic Islamic regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Palestinians in Gaza, who are decidedly, if you look at any public opinion survey, anti-American. America has an obsession with funding its own destruction. Well, I think that universities, having been under the spell of Wissenschaft, having been separated from reality in so many cases, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, should no longer receive money from the federal government at all. In fact, I think that there should be a wide-scale mass defunding of every public university, and there should be a yanking back of the student loan system. If this happens, universities will then be incentivized not by the artificial demands created by a surplus of subsidies coming from the government, but rather by the very real-world demands of reality that will then cause some of these doctoral degrees and some of these programs like gender studies or whatever to be cut and other more practical life skills to be emphasized. That would also mean no longer educating for the sake of education, because you wouldn't be able to afford that. You have to educate for the sake of accruing skills, which is what education in any meaningful sense must be. There's both a technical side of education and there's a moral side of education. The technical side of education says that we need to get skills. The moral side says that we need to learn virtue. Neither are being taught because virtue signaling has replaced the actual education of virtue in this country. And that, my friend, is a most serious problem. It's a most serious problem that lends itself towards the youth being weaponized in a foul agenda that does not benefit them, but actually fundamentally harms them. My friends, I am very, very concerned about the future of this country. I'm worried Because when I think about the revolutionary generation, when I think about the pressures they were under, and when I think about the moral ethos of America, I think about a society that requires cooperation. I think about a society that requires a rugged sense of do-it-yourselfism. I think about a society that requires being in touch with the world. But in this digital age, we are able to create silos that separate us from the stream of world events and turn us into tools, puppets that can be molded towards the ends of someone who has mastered the digital language, which is fundamentally against the language of the world. That is what we are seeing with this whole so-called Palestinian liberation surge. We are seeing all of this manifest. That's what we are seeing with DEI. We are seeing all of this manifest. It is downstream of the fundamental loss of moral education, which is also downstream of a fundamental loss of what it means to be a human being, which is also downstream of a fundamental loss of actually studying the human being, which is also downstream, most importantly, with the annihilation of the individual that is happening when these abstract movements take hold and infect our country. We're all the victims. Jewish students are the victims. Pro-American people are the victims. People that love society, a good society, we're all the victims of this nonsense. We have to confront these problems. We have to confront them head on. And we have to put a standard, a new standard in our society by discouraging certain kinds of behavior. Every protester that is taking over buildings, that is hitting police officers, they need to be arrested, they need to be prosecuted, and they also need to be made an example of to the public. But we should also reclaim that sense of goodwill that would have prevented this stuff from happening in the first place. Because there would have already been a pro-social sentiment within the hearts of men that would have said, hey, why would I hit someone to advance a cause within me? But again, when minds are captured by these revolutionary ideologies, there is no pro-social sentiment. It all becomes about doing whatever you must do at any means necessary. That is the first step towards totalitarianism. People think that totalitarianism comes in the form of a Il Duce or a Soviet banner. No. Totalitarianism can come in the form of people who seek to intellectually dominate the minds of the young or people who are impressionable and weaponize them towards a particular end. And that is what we are seeing, we have been seeing, with the leftist ideology that has racked our universities. My friends, we have to do something. And I believe that if we do something, if we begin enforcing the law, we begin pursuing true justice over social justice, and universities are set straight by not being given the room and ability to fail without consequences through student loans and educational funding, I think we're going to have a much better situation here. But right now, if we continue to enable this nonsense, it will only get worse, and it will bleed outside of the university and into American communities. One last point. Every person that resides in this country should have a strong sense of Americanism. Americanism is not simply a legal designation that they give you at the Census Bureau. Americanism is a philosophy that insinuates certain things: consent of the governed, popular sovereignty, individual rights, natural law, reason as a value, all of these things. That if you can't hold these things true and manifest them in your life, you can't be an American. And you can't partake in the kind of social experiment that America has been for the past 270 years. Any person that is in this country that rejects the philosophy of America needs to have their standing in this country reevaluated. That's going to be the only way we can truly reclaim what we have lost. And that's going to be the only way we can protect all peoples from the ravages of anti-civilizational ideologies like pro-Islamism and anti-Semitism that continue to fester and grow in a fertile soil at many of our educational institutions in this country. My friends, if you like this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can so we can get our message out there. If you want to support me, you can do that in so many ways. It's all in the comment section down below. Share this video, please. My friends, if you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, please be sure to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. It helps me a lot. My friends, study history, study philosophy, more morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.